Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very honored to take part in this debate on Bill S-219. And actually, Mr. Speaker, before I read my notes, I would like to comment on some issues that were raised by previous speaker. I don't think there's a full understanding that she has on issues surrounding that journey to freedom. You know, I would speak on more of a personal note, because I come from the country, and I came to Canada. I came from the communist country, from the communist regime. And many people that came before me were escaping, were trying to escape the regime that they didn't want to live in. The same thing happened with those poor boat people. They were escaping. They didn't want to live in a regime, in a communist regime, and face oppressions. Mr. Speaker, 250,000 people died trying to escape from the communist regime in unsafe boats. Doesn't this speak for itself? I mean, I don't know who needs an explanation. The comment that was made that the ambassador of Vietnam wasn't invited. Well, Mr. Speaker, ambassador of Vietnam represents the current government of Vietnam. It's not the democratic government. Let's make it very clear. Therefore, I would not be surprised that the ambassador of Vietnam would not be in support of this bill and creating a day to commemorate those brave people that were trying to escape and face and find safe haven here, like many others did. Mr. Speaker, after the war, Canada opened arms for a lot of people that came from Polish territories, people that took a journey, terrible journey. They were sent by Russians to Siberia. Many of them died, hundreds of thousands. Nobody will ever know the number. They joined the army. They fought alongside Canadians. And after the war, they had no country to go back to. They came to Canada. Many of them came. Generations in the 80s were able to leave communist Poland. They were stranded in refugee camps across Europe and other countries in the world. They found a safe refuge here. And we can repeat and repeat the stories of many groups from many places in the world. Canada has been always strong in supporting those that are oppressed, those that are denied basic human and democratic rights. And this is what this bill is about. Let's not confuse anybody. This is not a bill to divide communities. We have to fully understand who is a part of a community and who is not. Mr. Speaker, on April 30th, Canada's Vietnamese community commemorates the end of Vietnam War, a day that this legislation would recognize as a Journey to Freedom Day. It was on this day in 1975 that the fall of Saigon led to the exodus of over 840,000 Vietnamese citizens. They were prepared to take great risks, and many were even prepared to die rather than suffer at the hands of the communist regime. Many of those who fled the brutal regime had to resort to extreme measures. They fled on crowded, unseaworthy boats in the hopes of escaping to their freedom. Tragically, many of the Vietnamese boat people didn't survive the perilous journey. More than 250,000 of them drowned, starved, or were attacked by pirates. Miraculously, more than 60,000 of Vietnamese refugees did succeed in making their way here to Canada. Canadians welcomed refugees with open arms and even invited them to stay with them in their homes. More than half of the refugees were privately sponsored by generous individuals and groups of Canadians from all walks of life. Thanks to the overwhelming generosity and support of Canadians, entire refugee families were able to resettle here and build a new and peaceful life. The resettlement of such a large number of refugees in such a short amount of time was a tremendous achievement. And Canada's humanitarian efforts and compassion were recognized internationally. In response to these efforts, in 1986, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees awarded Canadian people with Nansen Medal, which in the refugee equivalent is equivalent of the Nobel Prize. This is the only time an entire country has been recognized with this honor, and for this, we should be all proud. Mr. Speaker, Bill S-219 aims to designate April 30th as Journey to Freedom Day. Not only would it commemorate the perilous journey 40 years ago of Vietnamese refugees to Canada, it will also pay tribute to an incredible humanitarian role played by thousands of Canadians, community and church groups, who opened up their hearts and found ways to welcome Vietnamese refugees here in our great country. As April 30th is already recognized by our Vietnamese community, it is appropriate to designate this day as a National Day of Remembrance. It would serve to commemorate the lives lost and the suffering experienced by those during the Exodus. It would also mark their arrival to freedom and the gratitude of the Vietnamese people to the Canadians for their generosity. Mr. Speaker, it is a Canadian tradition to commemorate tragic lessons in history so that they are never repeated. We believe we must not ignore the past, and this includes those shameful parts of our own country's history. Indeed, perhaps it is the memory of one of our own darkest moments that contributed to such an outpouring of generosity from Canadians towards the Vietnamese refugees. It is with great shame that Canadians recall the tragic decision to turn away the MS St. Louis in 1939. The outcome of that disturbing decision should not be forgotten. After being turned away by Cuba, the United States, and finally by Canada, the ship was forced to return to Europe, where almost 1/3 of its passengers ultimately perished in Holocaust. To memorize and educate Canadians about the MS St. Louis incident, a powerful memorial is now located at Pier 21 in Halifax, where the ship should have landed. On this day, we would mark a tragic period in history, but we would also commemorate a very important part of our country's proud humanitarian tradition. The outpouring of support from Canadian people during this time underscores our country's commitment to providing protection to the world's most vulnerable. It would also serve to remind all Canadians of how fortunate we are to live in one of the most free and democratic countries in the world, that we are proud to stand up for our values, our freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It should also be noted that this period in Canadian history is one that is not as well known among younger Canadians today. Unlike the First and Second World Wars and Korean War and Cold War, the Canadian connection to Vietnam War is often overlooked. I know, Mr. Speaker, you're showing me to conclude. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I would say that the resettlement of Vietnamese refugees, it's a very important part in our Canadian history. And that is why so many Canadians have voiced their support for this bill and are enthusiastic about the National Day of Commemoration. Mr. Speaker, for this reason, I urge all my colleagues to support this bill. It's a great bill, and we all, as Canadians, will be proud of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.